Hi, Misha here, and in my ongoing look at warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, we're getting to the end of the aircraft carriers, and today we can see the culmination of a lineage. Hiryu here was a modified Suryu design, fast, agile, and very advanced for her day, but made under restrictions of the Washington and London treaties. After Japan left those, they built the two sister ships in the Shokoku class. These were quite impressive, designed to carry more aircraft, but to be just as fast, to have a longer range, and designed with more armor protection, especially towards torpedoes. And to be fair, they did hang in a fight pretty good. But these were first developed in 1937, and therefore not necessarily for the latest, largest fighters of World War II. Also, they still had an unarmored flight deck. That leads us to this design, the Tahoe Class. Although there was only the one member, Taiho herself. This was to be the ultimate Japanese aircraft carrier, and really to be the beginning of a whole new generation of Japanese carriers. But of course, that would not come to be because Taiho herself was rather pointedly lost on her maiden voyage, or at least her maiden combat debut. But before we get to that, let's talk about what we have here. Just as Shokoku was based on a heavily modified Hiryu design, Taiho was based on Shokoku, but highly modified. And the aim here was to be able to manage the newer aircraft coming online, and to be able to hang in a fight, to take direct bomb hits to her flight deck, and not only survive them, but keep her operations going. This was a much heavier ship. She was nearly 30,000 tons standard and well over 37,000 tons full load. She was longer than Shokoku at 855 feet. And she had the largest flight deck at the time. It was 843 feet by 98.5 feet. It was serviced by 2 armored elevators, and that's the key. She had an armored flight deck. She was the first Japanese carrier, and really the only Japanese carrier to have it. The flight deck had about 3 inches of steel armor, and this was topped by a synthetic latex rubber type coating, anti-skid, and so on and so forth. She had 2 hangar decks, each just under 500 feet long, and they were enclosed. They had armored sides, although only the lower deck had some armor protection. They also gave more armor protection to the ordnance storage, the bombs and torpedo storage. But the design at this point is already floating very low in the water, so they neglect to really give much protection to the fuel tanks. They do give some using concrete, but It's kind of a half-assed. To help give her better air defense, because even the Japanese realized the 25mm anti-aircraft gun was crap, it had 6 of the new Type 98 electric-powered 3.9mm anti-aircraft guns. Even though she was pretty big and heavy, she was able to exceed 33 1/3 knots top speed. So, slower than a lot of previous ships, but then again, she was designed to carry quite a few more aircraft, although the number would change quite a bit. Originally, they were hoping for 96 planes plus 30 in storage, so in parts. Later, this was reduced down to 65 because new planes, but then upped again to about 78. In actuality, during her one combat mission, she carried a total of 65 planes originally. So she was relatively impressive and advanced. She was first ordered in 1939, laid down in July of 1941, so a few months before Pearl Harbor, and launched in April of 1943. And after fitting out and shakedown, she was fully commissioned into the fleet in March of 1944. And at the time was flying some of the newest aircraft, including the A6M5, the B6N, and the D4Y. So, what were Japan's plans? Well, after the disaster of Midway, they revised their construction and budgeting and decided that they would go forth with Taiho being the lead ship, and they would order a whole new series. They would have 5 more like her, but to an improved, modified design. And they would essentially build 15 modified Tahoe Class ships, but giving them armor and more modern aviation facilities. All of these wonderful sounding plans, which would have improved the Japanese fleet no end, and actually given them something to compete with America's Essex class, of course, came to naught, because while that was the thought in 1942, Japan had neither the resources, money, or time to build these new carriers, leaving Taiho really the only of her type. Taiho was commissioned into the Japanese Imperial Navy on March 7, 1944, and her first assignment was for basic training in home waters. And then on April 5, she was transferred and steamed for Singapore. And 10 days later, the admiral of the carrier division transferred his flag on board her. This would increase her nominal crew from about 1,750 up to about 2,150. And she would rendezvous with the remaining carriers of the fleet, namely Mishaco, Zuikaku, and begin training her air group, takeoff, landings, practice bombing runs, whatnot in May, transferring to Borneo, or at least off of Borneo. And as the Allies would attack the Marianas, it would lead to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, her first and only combat engagement. They would leave out on June 13, and then engaging in the battle on the 18th. And Taiho, along with 8 other carriers, now only 2 other fleet carriers, but you had a couple of middle range carriers like Junyo, and plenty of smaller light carriers were there. And Taiho was well protected, at least relatively speaking, against air attack. While she wasn't originally designed with radar, they were integrated into her systems during her construction. She had those 6 twin modern 3.9 electric-powered anti-aircraft guns, and she had over 50 of the older 25mm guns for whatever that's worth, not much. And again, she had an armored flight deck, she had an armored side, she had armored elevators, so on and so forth. One problem, she wasn't attacked by an airplane. She did have torpedo protection, but through a combination of design flaws, it just being a new ship, and it being a new, untrained, really untested crew, I mean, it didn't take a lot. She ended up being a glass cannon, basically. Early on the morning of the battle, around 7:45 a.m., the USS Albacore, a submarine, spotted her. Now, Taiho did not spot the submarine, so this gave them time to get into a good position. And at this time, American doctrine was to fire a full spread of torpedoes, so it would fire half a dozen, which was good for the Americans. Even as they were being fired from the submarine, Taiho, who was preparing to launch its first wave of fighters that day, didn't notice them. 4 of the torpedoes just missed. It happens. A 5th one was actually spotted by one of the airplanes taking off from Taiho, and the pilot, very heroically, dove into the path of the torpedo and actually detonated it at the cost of his own life and plane. But it was the 6th torpedo that scored home, but only one. And this final torpedo would hit her on the starboard side, a little bit forward of the island, pretty close to the elevator. And really, the damage wasn't that severe. It jammed the elevator in kind of a middle position in between decks. Annoying, but it had 2 elevators, and yeah, it wasn't that big of a deal. It knocked a hole in the side, but it was armored, so the hole was pretty minimal. But also, as I said earlier, while the ordnance stores were armor protected, the fuel system, the gasoline system, the petrol system was only partially protected. So this led to some of the lines being ruptured or just cracked. Now at this point, after this torpedo hits, the forward elevator is out of action, but that's really about it. There are no explosions, there aren't even any fires. So the admiral in charge orders that front elevator's hull be planked over so they can resume aircraft operations, and the captain of the carrier slows her a little bit, about 1 to 1.5 knots, to help reduce flooding in that front area, She was only down about 5 feet, not much for a carrier of this size, except for one thing. Taiho was already riding low in the water because of all of her armor. Actually, so much so that her hangar deck was right at the water line, and her elevators, the bottoms of the wells, actually went below the water line, which would turn out to be a rather big design problem. But that day, she had an air group of 56 planes originally. She had a pretty even mix of A6 M5s and D4Ys. She had 2 or 3 of the older D3As, and she had about 18 or so of the B6N, the new bomber. By 9:30 that morning, operations were resuming, and she would get 2 successive waves of planes off the deck. And at this point, they realized that there are gas fumes, but they basically do what they can to keep sparks, but it's an aircraft carrier. Because the hangar deck is enclosed, there's only so much they can do. And that forward elevator well gives it a great area, especially considering how low it is. It's a great area for seawater to accumulate, but also leaking gasoline fumes and oil. I'm sure it was just a fun area. It sounds disgustingly noxious. And because it had been planked over, it essentially capped it and gave it time to build up there. But it was mostly contained in that area. They had started breaking out portholes, opening up doors, and they have the ventilation system, the fan system, at a relatively modest setting. But as the fumes continued to build up, the officer in charge of damage control, a little after noon, orders the ventilation system turned to the max. Turn it up. Get all the fans on. Now, this might have been okay hours earlier when the leaks were just starting. But because it had several hours to build up in certain pockets, certain areas, this took those concentrated pockets, and it did spread that out a bit, but unfortunately it spread it out through the hangar deck and the rest of the ship. And how are you going to keep a spark from happening on a hangar deck? On top of that, they didn't even really try to fight the fumes coming out, for example, using foam or other firefighting gear. Still weren't any fires at this point. So they're still trying to keep up operations. But things come to a head at about 14:30 hours, 2:30 that afternoon. There is a massive explosion. It takes that fancy armored deck and buckles it upwards. It buckles and blows out the sides of the hangar deck, and the ship falls out of formation and begins to settle. And of course, after this explosion, you are having more fires, and now you're having real damage, and the systems are going offline. Still yet, the Admiral did not want to abandon ship, but his staff officers convinced him eventually to get off the ship. A destroyer would come alongside and start taking the crew off. Eventually, the Admiral would transfer his flag to the cruiser Hagaro, and much of the crew was successfully taken off before the second explosion at about 16:20 hours, 4:20 that afternoon. And so, of the over 2,100, nearly 2,200 men on board, only about 650 to 700 were lost, were killed. But the Battle of the Philippine Sea had not gone well for the Japanese. They lost 2 of their 3 remaining fleet carriers, including Taiho. Taiho was lost on her initial voyage. And she really didn't do anything. Her planes couldn't really claim victory against any Allied vessels of note. And with that, she went to the bottom. And it only took one torpedo from one submarine. I mean, there are literally destroyers out there that took more punishment than that. And you really can't lay all the blame on her young crew, inexperienced crew, because it did have some design flaws that really contributed. The fact that it was so bulky, so heavy, and that they chose not to protect the fuel systems says a lot. And just having those elevator wells running so low in the ship to the water line just allowed the stuff to collect, and then planking it over on top of that was probably not the best call of the Admiral. That said, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, along with the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot there, even if the Albacore hadn't claimed Taiho, chances are she probably would not have survived. After all, Shakaku did not, and Zuikaku barely escaped, and many other light carriers didn't either. And even if she had pulled out, by late 1944, the Japanese Navy was so short on pilots and aircraft and fuel that a carrier of this size would have been of limited use. But yeah, thus ends Japan's ambitions to make a modern armored carrier. And with that, next episode of this, I have one more carrier type to show you. And then we will have basically covered all of the major ones used in World War II by the Japanese. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.